That is amazing to me. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the solutions and these, quote, cures that have been found, that have been removed or squashed. I did have the opportunity to talk with Dan Haley this morning, and which was wonderful. He called me. He had a stroke, and he was the one who I was referring to earlier about politics and healing.
Sure.
Do you know the story about John Hoxsey, the famous Hoxsey story?
I have read the story, and I actually reread most of the story tonight in preparation for our conversation.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I wrote the introduction to
Dan's book, yes.
Dan's book, and what I said in the introduction was I didn't have any personal experience at reading Hoxsey of that study. I know he is moved to Texas, etc. But I did have a lot of personal experience with Stanislaw Brzezinski. Both of them deal with cancer. And
actually, if you don't mind, I'll recap that Hoxsey story real quick because
sure,
I had
go ahead.
Dan actually told it to me this morning. But there was a man by the name of John Hoxsey, and he had a racehorse who had cancer, and they were going to, put the horse down and so forth. They just couldn't do that because this was his favorite horse, so he just basically turned the horse to pasture to live out his life. And he noticed that the horse kept migrating to a certain area of the ranch, and was every time we would go out, he would just go to that certain area of the ranch. And in about 3 weeks' time, the tumor on the back of his hip scabbed over, and the scab fell off, and he was completely cancer-free. So John, who was an herbalist and extremely interested in herbal concoctions and did this in his life anyway, went to that section of the ranch to find out what the horse was eating, found a myriad of different herbs, put them in together into a concoction, and he found, as he started testing this on people, that this started to heal the people of cancer, that he was using it. And so then, from then on, he started several clinics. He turned this information over to his grandson, and on his deathbed, it was his grandson who was to carry on this work. He started 17 clinics over the United States, but he had also told his grandson to be very, very wary of being hunted down by the FDA, which was what happened. He moved his clinic to Mexico, and it still claims an 80% cure rate. It's still in Mexico. It's still in Tijuana. Tell me, is there other stories like that? You just mentioned the Brzezinski story.
Well, his book is filled with stories just like that. That was, I think, about 6 or 7 of personal experience with Brzezinski, and the pattern was exactly the same. Let's go back just a little bit and look at cancer, and because the reason that cancer is so persecuted is that what's at risk is our current method of doing business. The paradigm in cancer is to destroy the cancer cells, purge the body of cancer cells. This was started back at the turn of the century by William Halsted, who was able to do a radical mastectomy, hence the Halsted radical mastectomy for breast cancer. It was started in 1896. He was only able to do that because he could put women to sleep at that time. There was the development of anesthesia. Well, that activity generated the paradigm of purging the body of cancer, cutting it out, and then we have chemotherapy to poison the cells, and then we have radiation therapy to burn the cancer cells. So everything is built on the paradigm of eradication of the tumor cells. Now, what we do know, without any doubt whatsoever, is that none of those procedures work. Now, how do we know that? When you look at cancer, you look at the incidence of cancer. Let's take 100 people, and let's say or 1,000 people. Let's say the incidence of cancer is 80 people per 1,000 per year. Now, I'm making these up. This is not the real incidence, but I'm using numbers that we can play with and understand. And the death rate per year from cancer is 55. Out of 1,000 die per year, 80 people get it, which leaves 35 that do not die of cancer. These are, they call these spontaneous remissions or whatever. So you have a death rate in cancer of about 60 to 70%.
Uh-huh.
Now, the incidence of cancer and the death rate of cancer has been virtually constant, identical for over 100 years. Therefore, whatever we're doing doesn't work because it doesn't improve upon the incidence and the death rate that you had at the turn of the century. Now, let's compare this to another disease so that you understand how we know if we have a cure.
But there are, not to invalidate the 40 to 30% that do survive.
I know, but that's because everybody that gets cancer doesn't die of it. That was the same incidence and death rate. But let's look at pneumonia. Pneumonia used to be the most deadly disease we could be afflicted with up until around 1945. Now let's say the incidence of pneumonia was 100 out of 1,000, and the death rate of pneumonia was 80 out of 1,000. So here's 20% of those that get pneumonia survive. There was all kinds of therapies for pneumonia, but it stayed the number one killer. You know, there was where they'd operate and collapse the lungs and all this kind of stuff. And then 20% would survive, and we would always pat our pat the heads of those 20% and say, we cured you, we saved you. Now, we find an actual cure for pneumonia. Now, we still get 100 that get pneumonia, but now only 6 out of 100 die from pneumonia. So now the death rate dropped from 80% to 6% because we found the cure. See, when you actually separate the incidence rate and the death rate substantially, then you've got a cure or you've made some progress. And we have made no progress in cancer. But the paradigm of purging the body, the hope that every cancer patient has that this yet a new chemotherapy regimen or yet a new kind of radiation therapy or a new kind of laser surgery or something is going to work is the hope of virtually every cancer patient for the last 100 years.
Well, there are many of other opportunities that people have out there to find alternative treatments that do have actually a very high success rate and sometimes, in many incidences, higher than that of chemotherapy. When we come back, we're going to talk about solutions with so many people and drug companies peddling unproven and unsafe cures. How do you know who you can trust, especially when it seems that everyone's just out to get your money? So we're going to be right back. You're listening to Coast AM. I'm Lisa Garr.